and welcome to Dialogue. The China-Australia high-level dialogue has resumed in Beijing after a 3-year hiatus, and Prime Minister Anthony Albanese will visit China later this year, the first such trip since 2016. Are China-Australia relations back to normal? What are the remaining barriers in bilateral ties? How will the two nations carry their ties forward as the U.S. continues its containment policy towards China? To further discuss these questions, I'm glad to be joined by Geoff Raby, former Australian ambassador to China, and Chen Hong, professor at East China Normal University. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to Dialogue. Ambassador, I will start with you. The resumption of the high-level dialogue is seen as a sign of a further warming relations between China and Australia. So tell us more about this high-level dialogue. How important is it to, let's say, stabilize this relationship or for better communication between the two sides?
Oh, well, good evening. Pleasure to be here. Look, we don't want to put too much weight on the high-level dialogue. It is a worthwhile event. It used to happen annually. It hasn't happened since January 2020. COVID has been a factor in that, but also, of course, the cooling of the relationship since 2020 as well has probably meant that there's been no meeting. The fact that it's meeting again is welcome. It's a useful clearinghouse of perspectives and ideas from each side, but it alone is not going to advance the relationship much further, but it is a useful and welcome symbol that both sides are wanting to make progress and move the relationship from its current position, where it's being stabilized, back to a more normal relationship.
Professor Chen Hong, what do you make of the recent development? We have this high-level dialogue, and then at the end of that, there's an announcement of the Prime Minister Albanese upcoming visit to China, though we don't know the specific date yet. But anyway, we are seeing, let's say, some positive development here.
Yeah, the high-level dialogue first started in 2014 when, President Xi Jinping was visiting Australia. As you know, during that visit, the China-Australia relationship was elevated to comprehensive strategic partnership. And another important outcome was the high-level dialogue, which has been scheduled to take place every year in each other's country, alternately. The dialogue has been, positioned as a track 1.5 dialogue, which means these participants, delegates consist of current government officials and also previous, often, former officials, and also representatives from the business circle, the education circle, and the academic circles. When the 2020, dialogue was concluding, we were saying, both delegations, we were saying that we must work together to improve the relationship so that when the next, dialogue, which was to take place in Beijing in the following year, when the next, dialogue takes place, we will have a better position to start from. But as Geoff also said, bilateral relations went out of bounds, with the then, Scott Morrison government in Canberra. Miraculously, we can have a relationship, to the degree that the Secretary of Australia's Department of Foreign Home Affairs was threatening that the drums of war were beating for military confrontation with China. That was crazy, simply unbelievable. So when actually the Labour government's new foreign minister, Penny Wong, visited China last December, China's foreign affairs reached a consensus with her that high-level dialogue was consumed. So it was a long way. So I walked into the conference hall of the United States Guest House compound to attend the 7th dialogue last Thursday, and there was a sense of deja vu that we are working together to repair the relationship, which suffered so much during the terms of the previous Australian government. So I think it is a hard-won victory which gave China-Australia relations a new springboard, to move ahead, to move forward.
Ambassador, it has been some time, since the start of the new government in Australia to make efforts to stabilize or to improve the relationship with Beijing. How do you characterize the current status? Can we say the relations is back to normal now, or simply we are in the middle of the, say, efforts of improving or stabilizing the ties between the two countries?
Yes, I think we're still in the stabilisation phase. I mean, I would give the new Australian government quite good marks for how disciplined they've been in terms of discussing Chinese policy, Australia-China policy. I think they've been very disciplined. And certainly when they came in, the relationship seemed to be in free fall. Just there didn't seem to be a floor under the relationship. I think Penny Wong should be congratulated for having put that floor under it, and the Prime Minister maintaining cabinet discipline around the relationship. But there's still, I think, a fair way to go from where we are now to normalisation. Certainly, as you mentioned, the Prime Minister's visit's coming up before the end of this year. He's confirmed that. He's also said he's coming to China without any preconditions. I think that's very helpful. I wrote about that in the Australian Financial Review last week. And so we're making gradual steps. There's been a lot of ministerial engagement. Penny Wong has had the opportunity to engage directly with her counterparts. Trade ministers have met, but more needs to be done. But I would caution this, and that is, I don't think we can see the relationship go back to the effervescent, frothy state that it was in before 2016. We do have to accept the reality that the US, Australia's close ally, has taken upon itself to basically push back on China's ascendancy, and Australia has very much nailed its colours to that particular mast. So the geopolitical shifts that have occurred since 2016 mean that we will have a different sort of relationship in future, but it doesn't mean we can't have a productive, constructive and friendly relationship.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's quite realistic, and I think that's basically a clarification of even in the future, let's say we have a normal relationship, probably is also very different from what we had before
Yes.
2016. So Chen Hong, we know that in 2016 and before, the relationship was promising, between China and Australia. Even say if you go back a little bit further, for 2008, 2009, Australia was seen as a country, probably only Western country, which avoided the financial crisis. People attributed that to its relationship with China or the Chinese market for demand of Australian products there. But then, since then, 2017, 2018, we see the relationship, basically get deteriorated, and then it was exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. Tell us more about that. How had such good relations, gone off track so quickly?
Yeah, I think actually, in particular in 2017, I think all started in mid 2017 when the anti-China elements in Australia started to, hit up this kind of, China threat theory, talking about China's so-called, foreign interference, China's interference into Australia, and also in 2018, the Huawei, incident, because Australia was the first country in the world, to impose total ban, blanket ban on Huawei and its products and its, involvement in Australia's upgrading of its, broadband system. So that actually really was almost like regarded as a kind of, the start of the friction between the two sides. The previous, as you said, conducive, constructive, positive relationship starting to, slide into a kind of, green into, a kind of, very tense and, confrontational, relationship. That's actually really has been bringing a lot of pessimism to the sides. And then, of course, as Geoff was mentioning, the pandemic actually started to, exacerbate their relationship. And the previous Morrison government started to, finger point at China, in particular with regard to the tracing of the origin of the virus. So all that add up to a very tense relationship. As I said, I think the previous, Home Affairs Secretary was actually threatening to, to start a war, military confrontation with China. That is actually being regarded as a really adversarial relationship, from the point of Canberra. So I think that actually has got a kind of, kind of trajectory, which starting from a very high point and gradually, starting this kind of free fall. So I really feel that it is a tragic descent from a previously very proactive and productive relationship to the relationship that was really at a standstill before the Labour government took office in May last year.
Hmm. Well, Ambassador, despite this, let's say, unhappy or unsatisfactory state of relationship, in particular over the past few years, but the trade, trade is also part of the important focus of this recent high-level dialogue. Trade, tell us how important the trade is probably to both sides, or how important they are to each other, when it comes to raw materials, iron ore and coal, important to China, and the China market important to Australia, beef, wine, barley, and a lot of other products too.
Yes, no, look, absolutely. And the latest figures show that in terms of share of Australian exports, China is back up to accounting for about 39% of all of Australian exports. And that's more than the fourth next biggest export markets combined, including Japan, United States, New Zealand, and India. So Chinese trade is vital to Australia. We are probably China's eighth largest market. So there's strong complementarity. It's not just in the resources area, although resources, iron ore, LNG, some lithium now, coal dominate the trade, but it's also very much in the services area, education, financial services, tourism, and so on. So it's a very deeply integrated commercial relationship. And despite the trade measures which China introduced against Australia to demonstrate its unhappiness with the previous government, Australian-China trade has continued to grow quite strongly. And it just underscores the depth of the complementarities and how trade will overwhelm differences in political outlook and behaviour. But I have to say that in the sectors that have been subject to China's trade measures, those particular industries, such as wine, have been severely harmed by the measures. So in aggregate, trade continues to grow strongly and China is of overwhelming importance. But for certain industries that have felt the brunt of China's trade measures, they have been quite seriously harmed.
Mm-hmm. Let's have a short break. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back. Ambassador, Prime Minister Albanese is to come to China for a visit, the first in several years. So how much do we know? What's on top of his agenda?
Well, I think the immediate issues, well, it depends. It depends on what happens between now and his visit. There are the trade measures that I mentioned, and one of them is currently being adjudicated on in the WTO. One would hope that particular case concerning China's tariffs on Australian wine could be resolved and cleared away before the Prime Minister's visit. But I would hope that beyond that, there is a proper discussion about areas of mutual common interest where Australia and China can cooperate together. I mean, climate change is an obvious one, but I think there's a huge agenda around energy, green energy, green steel, and this is a very, very exciting potential area. Because after all, China is the world's biggest energy importer. Australia is one of the world's biggest energy exporters. If the two countries can't get together and help to create common solutions to some of the global challenges in the climate energy area, then who else is going to be able to do it? So I think I'd urge the Prime Minister and your leaders in China to look beyond and above the short-term irritants, although they have to be addressed, to look at these big areas of cooperation in the interest of all of our people.
Mm-hmm. Professor Chen Hong, what tops the Chinese agenda? In meeting with, in welcoming Prime Minister Albanese, what are the priorities for the Chinese side to improve the relationship, for example?
Well, now that Albanese has affirmed his visit to China this year, one of the incentives he mentioned in his interviews and other remarks was that 50 years ago, the former Australian Prime Minister, another Labour Prime Minister, Queensland, visited Australia in 1917 as Prime Minister. So Queensland made history when it established, diplomatic relationship with China. So Albanese's visit will be, celebrating, the 50th anniversary of Queensland's visits, which actually also, I think actually it is in Albanese's mind that actually will also be making history to restore a stabilized and also conducive relationship between China and Australia. Another thing I think, because I of course do not know the schedule of his visit, but he will be visiting China this later in the year. So probably, it will be, in late October and early November when Whitlam will visit China in 1973. So that will be coinciding with the, import expo in Shanghai, in China. So I think actually in Albanese's visits, the two events, his visits and also the import exports will actually happen together. That would actually set the tone, the most important theme for his visit. That is actually to, intensify and also to encourage trade in collaboration between China and Australia.
Mhm. So, Ambassador, there's still an issue of like, probably we need to continue to improve the trust among the two sides, in particular political trust, for example.
Yes, look, I agree very, very much, and it's going to be a long process to rebuild trust, and there's no doubt there's fault on both sides, and it's going to take a while to move on beyond that. One element which is going to be important in rebuilding our trust is to allow Australian journalists to come back into China. It's very important we have people on the ground telling on a regular basis the reality of contemporary everyday China. At present, all of the reporting from Australian journalists comes from outside of China. And it's very easy to stereotype and to get into an echo chamber in that circumstance. I think it would do China enormous benefit to allow the Australian journalists to return. And, obviously, Chinese journalists should be able to operate in Australia as freely as they have always done. So that will be a very important step towards starting the long process of rebuilding trust.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ambassador, earlier you mentioned about another factor, that is the U.S. We know Australia is a close ally of the U.S. in terms of security. And of course, the U.S. is changing its policy toward China from one of engagement to one of containment, let's say. And then, in what degree the U.S. hostile policy toward China influenced the decision-making process in Canberra?
Oh, it has a huge impact. There can be no doubt about it. And I wrote about this extensively in my last book, which was in November 2020. It was published, China's Grand Strategy and its implications for Australia. Australia has very much taken the position of the US in geostrategic competition with China. And we are supporting the US in that geostrategic competition. It is what it is. I think Australia, in policy terms, has made a mistake because I think we've mistakenly identified our interests with that of the US. It's one thing for the dominant power to resist the ascendant power. We all know that happens over and over again through the course of human history. It's quite another thing for a middle-sized country like Australia to identify its interests with resisting the ascendancy of the emerging power. Our interests are to find a way to manage our security requirements and needs with the United States and our economic and commercial needs with China. And I think the balance in our policy is not correct as it currently stands.
Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, this Labour government now in power is different to a certain degree from previous, like Morris government, on their China policy. I mean, both sides, both governments actually were, under they have been under the, let's say, influence or effects of the U.S. Policy toward China. For example, their trade war, tech war, economic war on China, that will definitely have some effects on Australian attitudes or policy even on China. And how will the Australian government, for example, the current government, navigate the fine line between, say, maintaining a positive trade ties, for example, with China, while also being a close ally of the U.S.?
Well, we've managed to do that for 40 odd years. It's only in relatively recent times that's been more difficult for us. Sure, the world has changed, but I don't think it's changed that much. We, as we talked before, there's great mutual interest. And I think the Australian government has a very good formula on this, and it just needs to stick to its own formula. And that is that we cooperate where we can in all spheres and at all times. We will disagree where we must, but the emphasis is on must. We don't willfully or gratuitously go out of our way to disagree. And what we do in terms of our own interests on all occasions. And I think, if we could be transparent with China about that, and clearly China has become a major power in the region, and all other countries, not just Australia, are having to work out how to juggle economic and security interests. And it's quite normal for countries to seek to push back on emerging powers or big countries, and to remind big countries that there are costs to bad behaviour. And all that has to be done, but I think it's got to be done, as I said, in a transparent way, keeping a very, very close eye on what our interests are, Australia's interests, and maintaining what I would regard as a very important independent foreign policy.
Chen Hong, on the Chinese side, it's a challenge, to, let's say, to handle the relationship with a middle-sized power like Australia. On one hand, we understand, they are a close ally of the U.S. Well, we are having this problem with the U.S. At the same time, we want to maintain a stable, mutually beneficial ties with Australia. It's also a challenge for China, how to deal with the U.S. on one side, at the same time their allies on the other side. So that's also a fine line in a way, right?
Yeah, I agree that actually there are new challenges for China to cope with into this world, in particular with the United States has been, quite, obstinate in its strategy to deter, to contain, and to sabotage China's development, in particular China's cooperation with the rest of the world. So I think actually for China, actually there is always been this kind of sincerity to achieve mutual benefits. Not a kind of one-way support or one-way output to the country with its, ulterior motives as the United States has been doing. But China actually has always been strengthening on the importance of mutual benefits, based upon trust. That is actually has been setting a tone. In particular, for example, like China has been working with ASEAN countries, in the Southeast Asia, with the South Pacific Island countries, based upon mutual trust to achieve, collaboration, and which would also contribute towards the local economy, which ultimately would be contributing to the economic activities and collaboration with China, for those island countries. I think actually that is, as you said, there's a fine line, but also, it is quite clear for China to be, sticking to its principles and also policies to work with the rest of the world in this area. But as we know that actually the United States has been putting together, small cliques, in addition to the Five Eyes Alliance, the Quad, the quadrilateral dialogue among the U.S., Japan, India, and Australia, and also IPF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and AUKUS, which has been designed to equip Australia with military capacity of, long-distance strike. So such, prospect is really strategically in line with Washington's, adventurism, which would ultimately disrupt, peace and stability in the region. So for China, really, this is really a very challenging scenario, which needs to, handle with vigilance and also with wisdom.
Ambassador, lastly, if you, let's look at the future relationship between China and Australia, with the U.S. at the background. In what way, or what suggestions do you have for both governments, the Chinese government, the Australian government, what they need to do to maintain this positive momentum and to maintain probably a long-term stable relationship between the two countries?
Yeah, I think the formula of the current government is the correct formula. That's to concentrate on our interest, our mutual common shared interests, and understand there will be differences, and differences will arise from time to time. But we mustn't focus on what divides us. We must focus much more on what unites us. And that's why I mentioned, in terms of the Prime Minister's agenda, it would be very, very helpful if everyone could raise their vision above and beyond the immediate irritants in the relationship and look at areas where Australia and China can cooperate. As I mentioned, green energy, green steel, the whole climate change agenda, asymmetrical security threats, organized crime, cyber. You can go through the whole list. We are both important countries in the in East Asia, in the Western Pacific, and we have an enormous amount to do together. We've done that in the past, and also obviously promoting trade liberalisation, open markets, and that should be our agenda for the future. But none of us know what the American political system is going to throw up at us in a couple of years' time either. So it's very important that we keep this dialogue going, our lines of communication open, concentrating on the things that unite us rather than those things that divide us, and start to show leadership in the region about how we can address some of these transnational, regional and global problems.
Well, many thanks to Ambassador and also Professor Chen Hong. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights here. With that, we come to the end for today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.